Hello everyone, this is Jeff Gambrone with the Mississippi History Channel. And in this episode I'm going to tell you about one of the lesser known conflicts in which Mississippians were engaged, the Spanish-American War. It's an interesting little conflict and hope you'll enjoy this episode. If you like it, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. It's really the only way I have to gauge how much interest there is in this kind of content, and if it's popular, I'll do more. So please let me know what you think. Also, leave any comments. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. So just let me know what you think. And to give you a little background on events leading up to the Spanish-American War, Spain once had a very vibrant empire in the New World, but by 1825 or so, this colonial empire had been reduced to just two islands. It had been reduced to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Their only other colonies were in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, the Caroline, Marshall, and Mariana Islands in Micronesia. That's really all that they had left. And after Spain had lost all of its mainland colonies in the New World, Cuba began exerting its own quest for independence. The people of Cuba fought a guerrilla war against Spain from 1868 to 1878, but they were unable to force the Spanish from the island. In the 1890s, Cubans once again rose up to try and push for their independence from Spain. Led by Jose Marti, a rebellion against the Spanish began on February 24th, 1895. Now, the events going on in Cuba were of great interest to the United States. American sugar producers owned very large tracts of land in Cuba. By 1895, the United States had invested more than $50 million in Cuba. In fact, forgot to show you the map. These are some of the islands that they held Cuba, and some of the campaigns here. Puerto Rico is also shown on here. And then this is one of the sugar mills in Cuba. And Americans were very heavily invested in these kinds of operations. In fact, annual trade with the Cuba, mostly in sugar, amounted to more than $100 million. So it was not a small amount of money that was involved. So the United States was looking on with great interest with what was going on in Cuba. Now, on June 12, 1895, President Grover Cleveland proclaimed that the United States would be neutral in the Cuban Rebellion, but American sentiment to intervene in the fighting was going to become rather marked, particularly after Spain sent General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to pacify the island. And this is a cartoon poking fun at Weyler that appeared in Puck magazine. But Weyler began a policy of reconcentration that forced the civilian population of the island into central locations. He was basically hoping to deny the rebels support from the civilian population, and so he forced all of the people into central locations just to try and keep them from giving any aid and comfort to the guerrillas. In March 1897, William McKinley became President of the United States, and he had only been in office about a year when the United States was going to end up going to war with Spain. There were two main events that led up to the war with Spain. First, the Spanish minister in Washington, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, wrote a letter critical of President McKinley that ended up falling into the wrong hands. It got published, and the American public was outraged at what they considered a gross insult to the United States. And relations with Spain suffered quite a bit as a result. The second and more important cause of the war with Spain was the explosion of the U.S. battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. The battleship had been sent to Cuba to protect American interests on the island, and the ship exploded on February 15, 1898, killing 266 sailors. A Spanish investigation had concluded that the blast that destroyed the ship came from within the vessel, but a U.S. team concluded that it was an external mine that had destroyed the Maine. And I don't think even to this day, no one has been able to conclusively prove the exact cause of the destruction of the Maine. But President McKinley, who had been against going to war with Spain, once the destruction of the Maine was accomplished, he was really forced by the rising tide of public opinion to demand that Spain grant independence to Cuba. The Spanish refused, and on April 25, 1898, the United States Congress approved McKinley's request for an armed intervention in Cuba and declared war on Spain, backdated to April 21st to legitimize some military operations that had already begun. And shown in this picture is the memorial to the men on the USS Maine who lost their lives in the explosion. This memorial is at Arlington National Cemetery, and it's really kind of a pretty impressive looking monument. In the state of Mississippi, most of the citizens of the state were in favor of going to war. Living in the deep South, not all that far from Cuba, citizens of the Magnolia State had long distrusted the motives of the Spanish. Also, 44 of the seamen on board the ship and half of the officer complement were Southerners, so there were lots of ties to the state amongst the crew of the Maine. And also, public sentiment was very much swayed by the journalism of the day. One newspaper in the state referred to the Spaniards as, quote, besotted with ignorance and bestial pride, and another said that Spain led Europe, quote, in refined cruelty and bigotry. Senator Edward C. Walthall introduced a joint resolution from the state of Mississippi to the United States Congress asking for American intervention to, quote, save the people of Cuba from the cruel fate of annihilation by the Spanish government. And these are the kinds of things that Mississippians were seeing in newspapers, both local and national papers. There was just a lot of anger ginned up by the press. And despite the fact that war was very popular with a lot of the citizenry, not all Mississippians were eager for a war with Spain. Mississippi Governor Anselm J. McLaurin was specifically asked by newspaper owner William Randolph Hearst for his views on a war with Spain. And in a letter to the Clarion Ledger, he wrote, if Spain is prosecuting a savage war upon a defenseless people and disregarding all the rules of warfare observed by civilized countries, and our government feels that it is our duty to stop such butchery at our doors, let it be so announced. But we should not take for a pretext for war an incident for which we cannot declare upon evidence that Spain was responsible. To proceed upon such a pretext would encourage other disasters, such as the destruction of the Maine. Well, McLaurin may have been against war, but overall the sentiment in the United States was very much in favor of the conflict. And it was not long before war was brought to the Mississippians' doors. When the United States ended up declaring war on Spain, making the whole point moot, Governor McLaurin did issue a proclamation on April 29, 1898, regarding Mississippi's role in the war. And he wrote, quote, the Secretary of War, by direction of the President, has requested 2 regiments of infantry from the state of Mississippi as the quota of volunteers to serve for the period of 2 years unless sooner discharged. And the call for Mississippi to form 2 infantry regiments was met with great excitement, and hundreds of men flocked to Jackson as military companies from all over the state arrived to answer this call from the governor. On reaching the capital city, these volunteers were all sent to Camp Pat Henry, which was on a site very near Millsaps College. And the initial regiment raised from Mississippi was at Camp Pat Henry was the 1st Mississippi Volunteer Infantry, which was mustered into Confederate service on May 26, 1898. It was led by Colonel George M. Govan, who was a Confederate officer from Mississippi during the Civil War. The regiment left the state for training at Camp Thomas in Chickamauga, Georgia on May 30th, 1898. And the next regiment raised at Camp Pat Henry was the 2nd Mississippi Volunteer Infantry, which was mustered into United States service June 9, 1898. Colonel William A. Montgomery commanded the unit. This is Montgomery here in his uniform, and he also was a Confederate officer during the Civil War. On June 16, 1898, Colonel Montgomery was ordered to take the regiment to Camp Cuba Libre at Jacksonville, Florida. And this big picture is taken at Camp Cuba Libre. One of the soldiers in the 2nd Mississippi Infantry was Howard Byers, who was in Company G of the regiment. And he wrote his family a letter describing what life was like at Camp Pat Henry. He said, "We have to drill 5 hours a day, and it is pretty tough when the sun is shining hot. We have to be up every morning by 5 o'clock to answer roll call, and again at 9 o'clock at night. We have plenty to eat such as it is, but half the time it is not cooked right. I have a cot that I sleep on, but all the other boys sleep on the ground in the tents with straw and a blanket above them." In late June of 1898, the Secretary of War, Russell A. Alger, asked the state of Mississippi to furnish a 3rd Infantry Regiment for the conflict with Spain. The 3rd Mississippi Volunteer Infantry was formed, but by that time there was not a great rush to join as there had been with the 2 previous regiments. One Mississippi newspaper speculated that recruiting was slow due to the perception that the war would be over before the unit ever had a chance to fight. Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Banks, yet another Confederate veteran of the Civil War, was named commander of the 3rd Mississippi Infantry. In the end, just to get up enough men to complete the regiment, Mississippi ended up recruiting 300 volunteers from Chicago, Illinois, to join the regiment. Illinois had more volunteers than it had room in the regiments it was asked to provide, so there were a number of men from Chicago that were wanting to join up, and they were happy to join any unit that would take them. On tendering his Illinois soldiers to serve in a Mississippi unit, Colonel W.T. Dowdell told the Clarion Ledger, "We come from Illinois, the home of Abraham Lincoln, to Mississippi, the home of Jefferson Davis, to tender a regiment of soldiers to help uphold and defend the honor and guard the name of the Magnolia State." And there was one other unit formed in Mississippi during the Spanish-American War, and it was the curiously named 5th Immune Regiment, United States Volunteers, mustered into service at Columbus, Mississippi, and it was made up of men from Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And the thinking was that since these are men from the Deep South, they would be more acclimatized to the types of tropical diseases that would be common in Cuba, and that's why they were named the 5th Immune Regiment. And the colonel of the 5th Immune Regiment was Lieutenant Colonel Hernando de Soto Money, a U.S. Senator from Mississippi. He was in charge of the unit. And the major of the unit was another well-known politician, James K. Vardaman, who would in the very near future become governor of the state. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Mississippi Regiments and the 5th Immune Regiment were all white units. The Army was still segregated at this time, and no black units were raised from Mississippi for the Spanish-American War. But black Mississippians did most certainly take part in this conflict. The most prominent African-American from Mississippi that participated in the war was John Roy Lynch, who had served in the U.S. House of Representatives from Mississippi during Reconstruction. This is a photo of Lynch taken, or an engraving taken about the time that he would have been serving in the House of Representatives. During the conflict, Lynch was appointed a major and also paymaster of the U.S. Volunteers during the war by President William McKinley. And this is a picture of Lynch at the time of the Spanish-American War. Now, while the Mississippi regiments were still training in the United States, the war was very quickly being decided on other fronts. The Spanish fleet in the Pacific was destroyed by Commodore George Dewey, shown in the illustration here, commanding the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay, May 1st, 1898. On June 20th, the U.S. Fifth Army Corps under General William Shafter arrived in Cuba, and on June 1st, 1898, they attacked the main Spanish garrison of 10,000 men at Santiago de Cuba. Fierce fighting took place at El Caney and San Juan and Kettle Hills, and this is a photo showing some of the U.S. troops under fire during the fighting around San Juan and Kettle Hills. U.S. forces pushed the Spanish back from these positions, and the Spanish fleet in Cuba was destroyed by the U.S. fleet under Commodore Winfield Scott Shaley, who sank 4 Spanish vessels and forced the last vessel to beach herself to avoid sinking. The destruction of the Spanish fleet convinced the garrison of Santiago de Cuba to surrender on July 17, 1898. On August 12th, President McKinley signed a protocol that provided for Cuban independence and the cession of Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. The protocol stated the fate of the Philippines would be decided at a peace conference between the United States and Spain to be held in Paris. Strong public opinion, however, forced President McKinley to seek annexation of the Philippines, and at the peace conference that was held in Paris, the Spanish accepted the U.S. terms. The Spanish agreed to accept $25 million to pay for Spanish property in the Philippines, and the Treaty of Paris ending the war was signed on December 10, 1898. Although there were no Mississippi units that saw action during the Spanish-American War, a number of individuals from the state did fight with regular Army regiments, and 2 Mississippians were recipients of the Medal of Honor. You had Ira C. Wellborn and John W. Hurd. In addition, there were also a large number of Mississippians fighting in the 24th and 25th U.S. Infantry at San Juan Hill, and these were all black regiments, and they particularly distinguished themselves under fire during this battle. In fact, excuse me. In fact, one writer said of the 24th U.S. Infantry, quote, "The magnificent courage of the Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas Negroes, which make up the rank and file of this regiment, is the admiration of every officer who has written here since the fight." The 5th Immune Regiment, which was made up primarily of Mississippians, did see some occupation duty in Cuba from August 1898 through March 1899. Major James K. Vardaman wrote a number of letters to his wife while he was on this occupation duty. In one of them, he said to his wife, "I only regret that the 5th Regiment had not been with them," talking about the soldiers who had been in combat. "While in all probability many of our brave boys would have gone down in that enjoyment, the dangers which they would have encountered then are not greater than the dangers that they confront them now. We are to suffer the ravages of a deadly fever, the dangers of pestilence, and all that without any compensating results." So even though they were named the 5th Immune Regiment, they were not immune in any sense whatsoever to the tropical diseases common to Cuba. And a lot of the men did take sick while they were overseas. And although the war lasted only a matter of months, the conflict did have some real effects on the state of Mississippi. During the fighting, fruits, cereals, and all manners of produce increased in price, and there was some hoarding of food. The most important result, however, of the war was that it allowed Mississippians and Southerners in general an opportunity to prove that the former Confederate states were loyal to the United States government. The Clarion Ledger quoted one Confederate veteran as saying, quote, I speak my own sentiments truly, and I believe it to be the sentiments of every ex-Confederate soldier when I say that we tried for 4 years to whip up Uncle Sam, and now we shall refuse to allow somebody else to come here and do what we couldn't do ourselves. Another article in the Clarion Ledger explained how the Spanish-American War was helping the country to forget the bitterness of the Civil War. And it said, at last the boys of all sections of our common country are standing shoulder to shoulder for the grand old flag. Thank God that they had the chance to do so, for they have been praying for it for a generation. It would be an idiot who should say that we are not a united country. Long live Uncle Sam. And several Mississippians who served during the time of the conflict went on to have notable political careers. Among them, Benjamin G. Humphreys of the 2nd Mississippi Infantry Regiment became a congressman from the state, and Edmund F. Noel who also of the 2nd Regiment, became governor. And then, of course, the already mentioned James K. Vardaman of the 5th Immune Regiment would go on to become governor as well. In the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Mississippi Infantry Regiments, 115 officers and 2,695 men served during the Spanish-American War. Of that number, 2 officers and 56 enlisted men died of disease, and 1 enlisted man died in an accident. There were no combat casualties, as the units didn't see any combat. In the 5th Immune Regiment, a total of 81 officers and 1,101 men served during the war. It's not known how many of these men were Mississippians, because there were some from neighboring states as well. In the regiment, 34 enlisted men died of disease, and 1 died in an accident during the war. So casualties in this conflict were very slight, and they were entirely relegated to those who died of disease or, in a couple of cases, accidents. And there were Mississippians who served in the U.S. Navy during the Spanish-American War, but it's kind of hard to put any concrete numbers on since they were serving in the regular U.S. Navy. They were not counted by state. But a couple of the prominent Mississippians who served, Richard Henry Lee of Batesville was a junior officer during the conflict. He stayed in the Navy after the war and rose to the rank of admiral and was commander-in-chief of the United States Fleet in 1932 and 1933. And Mississippi's last surviving Spanish-American War veteran was Henry K. Hammett of Claiborne County. He served in Company B of the 1st Mississippi Infantry Regiment. Hammett died in November 1981. He was well over 100 years old at the time he passed away. And that's just amazing. I was a teenager when he passed away. I really wish I could have met him. It would have been amazing to meet someone that was actually a soldier during the Spanish-American War. And if you go to the War Memorial Building, sitting out to the one side of the building is the memorial put up to honor the men that served in the Spanish-American War. It was a very small conflict, and it's a very small monument. A lot of people overlook it. But the next time you happen to be near the War Memorial Building, take a look at this monument and remember those men who went to war to fight for the independence of Cuba. And this ends this little talk on Mississippi and the Spanish-American War. Please leave any comments you might have. I'll be glad to respond to them. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and also subscribe if you haven't done so. And thank you very much for watching.